You're standing in the Senate House, March 15th, 44 BC. The most powerful man who ever lived is bleeding out at your feet. 23 stab wounds. Sai, his own son, his adopted son, just drove a dagger through his heart. But here's the thing that will make your blood run cold. They thought they were heroes. 60 senators, 60 daggers, one dead dictator. And in that moment, as Julius Caesar's blood pooled on the marble floor, they believed they'd just saved the Roman Republic. They were dead wrong. What they'd actually done was sentence themselves to death and hand the world to a monster far worse than Caesar ever was. If you enjoy these dark corners of history, hit subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The liberators, that's what they called themselves, expected the people of Rome to pour into the streets with flowers and cheers. Thank you for killing our dictator. Thank you for giving us freedom. Instead, silence. Dead, terrifying silence. Because the common people of Rome didn't live in marble villas. They lived in cramped insulae, 6-story tenements that regularly collapsed or burned. They worked brutal jobs in sweltering bakeries, dangerous construction sites, or hauling cargo at the docks. Caesar, the tyrant, had given them bread distributions, public works jobs, and most importantly, stability. These senators? They offered nothing but abstract philosophical concepts about republican virtue and rivers of blood. The mastermind was Gaius Cassius Longinus, a man whose hatred for Caesar had fermented into something toxic and consuming. Cassius had served under Caesar in Syria, had watched the man's meteoric rise from general to god, and had decided that only death could stop him. But Cassius was smart enough to know that mere murder wouldn't be enough. He needed legitimacy, a symbol that would transform assassination into justice. He found that symbol in Marcus Junius Brutus, Caesar's golden boy, his protege, the closest thing to a son Caesar had before adopting Octavian. Brutus carried the blood of Lucius Junius Brutus, the legendary founder of the Republic who had expelled the last king 5 centuries earlier. If the descendant of that hero struck down Caesar, it wouldn't be regicide, it would be liberation. The recruitment was careful, methodical, almost artistic in its precision. Cassius approached senators whose careers had stalled under Caesar's autocracy, military commanders whose glory days had ended, idealistic young men who genuinely believed in republican virtue, and bitter old families whose influence had waned. Each conspirator had his own reason to want Caesar dead: political ambition, wounded pride, philosophical conviction, personal grudges that had festered for years. They chose their moment with theatrical precision. The Ides of March, when Caesar would address the Senate at the Theatre of Pompey, the irony was exquisite. Caesar would die at the foot of his greatest rival's statue, in a building dedicated to the man he had destroyed in civil war. But Caesar almost didn't go. The night before, his wife Calpurnia was tormented by prophetic dreams. She saw their house's roof collapsing, Caesar bleeding in her arms, herself weeping over his corpse. She begged him to stay home, to postpone the Senate meeting, to listen to the soothsayers who warned him to beware the day. Even Caesar hesitated. The great general who had crossed the Rubicon, who had conquered Gaul, who had marched on Rome itself, was unnerved by omens and dreams. But Decimus Brutus, not Marcus, but another conspirator, arrived at Caesar's house with smooth words and gentle mockery. Surely the great Caesar won't disappoint the Senate over women's nightmares. What will people say if you hide at home because your wife had a bad dream? Caesar's fatal flaw wasn't ambition, it was pride. He couldn't bear to appear weak or superstitious. Against every instinct, every warning, every sign the gods had sent, he went to the Senate. The conspirators were waiting. When Caesar entered the theatre, Artemidorus, a Greek teacher who had discovered the plot, pressed a scroll into his hands, a list of the conspirators and their plan. "Read this immediately," he urged. "It concerns you greatly." But Caesar, surrounded by senators seeking his attention, handed it to an aide, unread. The scroll that could have saved his life was tucked away, forgotten in the rush of business. The conspirators surrounded him under the pretense of presenting a petition for the recall of an exiled senator. They pressed close, ostensibly showing respect and urgency, till Scimba grabbed Caesar's toga, pulling it down from his shoulders. the signal for attack. Caesar protested, tried to break free from Simba's grip. "Why, this is violence," he shouted. Then steel found flesh. Publius Casca struck first, his dagger slashing across Caesar's neck, a shallow wound, drawn by trembling hands and nerves. Caesar spun like a wounded animal, grabbed Casca's wrist, with the grip of a man who had held a sword for 40 years. "Casca, you villain, what are you doing?" he roared in Latin, then switched to Greek. "Help, brother," calling to Casca's brother in the crowd. But more blades appeared. 10 senators, 20, 30, a forest of steel converging on one man. Most of the wounds were superficial, the senators stabbing wildly in their panic and frenzy. Some cut each other in the chaos. So desperate were they to participate in the killing, to share in the glory of tyrannicide. Caesar fought like a cornered lion. He had no weapon, but he used his fists, his voice, the sheer force of his presence. For a moment it seemed possible that the most powerful man in the world might fight his way through 60 assassins through will alone. But then he saw a face in the crowd of killers that changed everything. Marcus Junius Brutus stepped forward, dagger in hand, approaching the man who had loved him like a son. According to every witness, Caesar's resistance collapsed in that instant. Some claim he spoke the famous words, "Et tu, brute," but others recorded something more heartbreaking, a wordless gasp of recognition and betrayal that cut deeper than any blade. Caesar looked into the eyes of his beloved Brutus one last time, then pulled his toga over his head. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of watching him die. He wouldn't let Brutus see the pain in his eyes. He collapsed at the base of Pompey's statue, his blood pooling at the feet of his greatest enemy's marble image. 23 wounds. The physicians later determined that only one was mortal, the blow that pierced his heart. The rest was savage but superficial, inflicted by men who had never killed before, who stabbed with trembling hands and closed eyes. The conspirators stood over the body, daggers dripping, togas splattered with blood. They raised their weapons skyward and proclaimed liberty restored. Brutus tried to address the terrified senators and slaves who had witnessed the murder, explaining that they had killed a tyrant, not a man. His voice shook as he spoke of duty, virtue, the love of republic over person. They expected cheers. They got horrified silence. The liberators marched from the theatre to the Capitol, bloodied daggers held high like sacred relics. Citizens fled before them, shuttering shops and barring doors. This wasn't the liberation they had promised. It was chaos unleashed, the natural order shattered by an act of unspeakable violence. At the Capitol, the conspirators fortified themselves and waited. They expected delegations of grateful citizens, offers of support from fellow senators, congratulations from the people they claimed to have freed. Instead, they found themselves isolated on a hill, surrounded by a city that watched them with fear and suspicion. The silence was their first death sentence. Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, wasn't in the Senate that day. Gaius Trebonius, one of the conspirators, had cleverly engaged him in conversation outside the theatre, keeping Caesar's most loyal lieutenant away while the killing was done. When Antony heard the news, his first instinct was to flee. Caesar was dead, and as his closest ally, Antony would surely be next. But Antony was no coward. He was a veteran of a dozen campaigns, a man who had survived the brutal politics of late Republican Rome. Instead of running, he played the most dangerous game of his life. He appeared to negotiate with the assassins. He met with them publicly, exchanged handshakes, offered seemingly sincere congratulations on their courage. He even invited them to dinner, enemies breaking bread together in a grotesque parody of reconciliation. The conspirators, desperate for legitimacy and acceptance, grabbed onto this lifeline with both hands. Meanwhile, the Roman Senate, terrified of civil war and desperate to restore order, granted amnesty to all the conspirators, a formal pardon written into law protecting them from prosecution. For a moment, it seemed that blood might not call for blood, that the ancient Roman tradition of negotiation and compromise might prevent the catastrophe everyone feared. The conspirators allowed themselves to hope. Maybe they had pulled it off. Maybe they had killed the tyrant and lived to tell the tale. They made one final, catastrophic error. They agreed to let Caesar have a state funeral. The funeral of Julius Caesar became the turning point of Western civilization. 2 speeches were given that day, and the contrast between them reveals everything about the difference between cold philosophy and burning emotion. Brutus spoke first from the rostra, the speaker's platform in the forum. His oration was a masterpiece of Stoic philosophy, cold, reasoned, logical. He spoke of duty and virtue, of the conflict between personal love and civic responsibility. He explained that he hadn't killed Caesar from hatred, but from a higher love, the love of Rome itself. I loved Caesar, but I loved Rome more. The crowd listened in confused silence. Brutus's arguments were intellectually sound, philosophically pure. He had acted not from base motives like envy or ambition, but from the noblest of impulses, the preservation of republican liberty. The people seemed to accept this terrible necessity, nodding along with his careful reasoning. The conspirators breathed sighs of relief. Perhaps Brutus's reputation and eloquence had saved them after all. Then Mark Antony took the stage. Antony was many things: a heavy drinker, a notorious womanizer, a man of appetites and excesses, but he was also one of the greatest orators Rome had ever produced, and on this day he delivered the performance of his lifetime. He didn't shout, he didn't immediately accuse. His voice began as barely a whisper, but it carried to every corner of the packed forum with an intimacy that made every listener feel he was speaking directly to them. "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him." He spoke of how the evil that men do lives after them, while the good is oft interred with their bones. Perhaps, he suggested, it should be so with Caesar. He called Brutus an honourable man. He called them all honourable men. But then he began to catalogue Caesar's achievements: the conquest of Gaul that had filled Rome's treasury, the victories that had expanded the empire to unprecedented size, the clemency he had shown to his enemies, pardoning even those who had fought against him in civil war, the wealth he had brought to Rome, the games and spectacles he had funded for the people's entertainment. And with each achievement, Antony returned to his refrain: "But Brutus is an honourable man." With each repetition, the word honourable began to curdle and rot, becoming less praise than poison, less tribute than sarcasm, so sharp it could cut throats. The crowd began to murmur, then to shift restlessly. Antony's voice grew stronger, more passionate. He spoke of Caesar's love for the Roman people, of how the dictator had wept when the poor cried, of how he had always put Rome's interests above his own ambition. But Brutus says he was ambitious, and Brutus is an honourable man. Then came Antony's master stroke. He descended from the rostra and approached Caesar's body, which lay on a bier in the centre of the forum. With theatrical precision, he lifted the blood-soaked toga that covered the corpse, revealing the 23 wounds that had destroyed the most powerful man who ever lived. "Look," he said, his voice breaking with genuine or carefully crafted emotion. "In this place ran Cassius's dagger through. See what a rent the envious Casca made. Through this, the well-beloved Brutus stabbed." The crowd gasped and pressed closer. This wasn't philosophy anymore. This wasn't abstract political theory. This was a man they had known, a man who had fed them and entertained them and led them to victory, butchered by those he had trusted most. But Antony wasn't finished. He pulled out a scroll, Caesar's will, with dramatic flair. He announced that the dead dictator had left his private gardens on the Tiber to the people of Rome, to be public parks in perpetuity. The crowd stirred with interest and gratitude. Then came the final blow. Caesar had left every Roman citizen, every man standing in that forum, 75 silver denarii, more money than most of them saw in a year. Hell broke loose. Brutus's carefully reasoned speech evaporated like mist before a volcano. Pure raw emotion exploded through the crowd like a contagion. These people hadn't known Caesar the politician or Caesar the dictator. They had known Caesar the benefactor, Caesar the provider, Caesar the generous patron who had improved their lives in concrete, measurable ways. The crowd's grief and rage took on a life of its own. They tore apart the wooden benches and merchant stalls surrounding the forum, building an impromptu funeral pyre for their hero right there on the sacred ground where generations of Romans had conducted the business of the Republic. They lifted Caesar's body onto this makeshift pyre and set it ablaze. As the flames rose toward the heavens, carrying Caesar's spirit to join the gods, the crowd's mourning transformed into something far more dangerous. They grabbed torches from the funeral fire and became a hunting pack. They weren't looking for liberators anymore. They wanted blood. They wanted the men who had murdered their patron, their benefactor, their champion. The abstract concept of republican liberty meant nothing to them compared to the concrete reality of Caesar's generosity. Their first victim was an innocent man, Helvius Cinna, a poet who had the misfortune to share a name with Lucius Cornelius Cinna, one of the conspirators. The mob found him in the street and surrounded him. His pleas meant nothing. "I'm just a poet. I write verses. You want Cinna the praetor, not me." His terror was irrelevant. They ripped him apart with their bare hands, tearing him limb from limb in the street. It was the first payment of the blood debt, and it wouldn't be the last. Brutus, Cassius, and the other conspirators watched this horror unfold from their houses scattered across the city. They saw the flames of Caesar's pyre lighting up the night sky. They heard the roar of the crowd baying for their blood. They watched the people they claimed to have liberated, marching through the streets with torches and improvised weapons, hunting for assassins to kill. Their republican dream had become a nightmare beyond their darkest imaginings. The restoration of liberty had unleashed chaos. The death of the tyrant had birthed anarchy. They fled Rome that very night, slipping out of the city like thieves. No longer senators, no longer statesmen, no longer liberators. They were fugitives with prices on their heads and nowhere to hide. But while the conspirators scattered to the winds, running for their lives toward the eastern provinces where they might find armies and allies, the real danger was just landing on Italian shores. His name was Gaius Octavius, later to be known as Octavian, and eventually as Augustus Caesar. He was 18 years old, sickly, unknown, and utterly dismissed by everyone who mattered in Roman politics. When the news of Caesar's assassination reached him at Apollonia, where he was completing his education, most observers assumed he would remain a historical footnote. They were catastrophically wrong. The bombshell wasn't Caesar's death, it was his will. The dictator had formally adopted this unknown teenager as his son and primary heir, leaving him not only Caesar's vast personal fortune, but something infinitely more valuable, Caesar's name. In Roman culture, adoption wasn't just a legal formality, it was a sacred bond that created real kinship. Octavian didn't just inherit Caesar's money, he inherited his identity, his legacy, his accumulated honors and achievements. More importantly, he inherited the loyalty of Caesar's veterans and the love of Caesar's people. When Octavian landed at Brundisium in southern Italy, he brought no army, commanded no legions, held no office. He was just a teenager with a famous name and a dangerous gleam in his eye. But he understood something the conspirators had missed entirely in the Roman world. Names had power, and Caesar was the most powerful name of all. The moment he set foot on Italian soil, he began signing documents as Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. To the people and the legions, he wasn't Octavian anymore. He was Caesar, returned from the dead to claim what was rightfully his. When he reached Rome, Mark Antony was already consolidating power as the senior surviving Caesarion. Antony viewed this teenager as an irrelevant annoyance, a sickly boy playing at being important. In one of the greatest miscalculations in history, Antony refused to hand over Caesar's inheritance, using the money instead to strengthen his own political position and buy loyalty for himself. Fatal mistake. When Antony denied him his inheritance, Octavian did something unprecedented, something that announced to the world that a new kind of politician had arrived on the scene. He liquidated his own property, his family estates, his personal possessions, everything he owned, to pay the Roman people the 75 denarii Caesar had promised them in his will. The effect was electric. Overnight, the dismissed teenager became the darling of Rome's masses. More importantly, he became the hero of Caesar's veterans, battle-hardened soldiers who had followed their general to the ends of the earth and back. These men had loved Caesar like a father, and they saw in his adopted son the living embodiment of their dead commander. Octavian didn't ask for their loyalty. He bought it with Caesar's name, Caesar's money, and most powerfully, Caesar's promise kept. Within months of arriving in Rome, this unknown 18-year-old had assembled a private army of veteran soldiers who would follow him anywhere. The political earthquake had begun. Antony and Octavian's rivalry erupted into open warfare in northern Italy. While they battled each other, both claiming to be Caesar's true heir, disturbing reports arrived from the eastern Mediterranean. Brutus and Cassius weren't sitting idle, licking their wounds and accepting defeat. The conspirators had fled to the richest provinces of the Roman world, Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt, where they systematically looted the treasuries, extorted the local populations, and recruited massive armies. Using Caesar's own methods against his memory, they had assembled 19 legions and accumulated war chests large enough to challenge Rome itself. The news hit Antony and Octavian like a physical blow. Whatever their personal animosity, they both understood that Brutus and Cassius posed an existential threat to everything they represented. The assassins were marching west with the largest army the eastern Mediterranean had ever seen, intent on finishing what they had started in the Senate House. The two avengers of Caesar put aside their mutual hatred and formed an alliance that would reshape the ancient world. They met on a small island in a river near Bologna. Antony, Octavian, and Marcus Lepidus, another of Caesar's former generals, who controlled significant military forces. There, surrounded by the mud and mist of a northern Italian autumn, these three men carved up the Roman world, like butchers dividing a carcass. The second triumvirate wasn't an alliance, it was a predator's pact. They divided the empire into spheres of influence, allocated legions and provinces among themselves, and planned the greatest war the Mediterranean had ever seen. But first they needed to secure their rear, eliminate their enemies at home, and raise the enormous sums required to finance their coming campaign. They unleashed the proscription. The proscription lists were more than enemy rosters. They were public death sentences posted throughout the city. Hundreds of senators and thousands of wealthy Romans were declared enemies of the state, their names written on wooden tablets and nailed up in the forum for all to see. Anyone could kill them. Not only was it legal, but there were substantial rewards. The assassin received a portion of the victim's property, while the rest filled the triumvir's war chest. Rome descended into a paranoia-fueled bloodbath that made the conspiracy against Caesar look like a gentleman's disagreement. Slaves murdered their masters to win freedom and gold. Sons betrayed fathers for earlier inheritances. Neighbors denounced neighbors to settle old grudges or acquire coveted property. The city became a hunting ground where wealth was a crime and prominence meant death. Trust evaporated entirely. Senators who had escaped the initial lists lived in constant terror, never knowing when their names might appear on the next update. Some went into hiding, living like criminals in their own city. Others fled Rome entirely, abandoning everything they owned to save their lives. But on those lists, Mark Antony insisted on one name above all others: Marcus Tullius Cicero, the greatest orator in Roman history, and the man whose eloquent speeches had made Antony a laughingstock throughout the civilized world. Cicero hadn't been one of Caesar's assassins, but his crime was arguably worse. He had survived. In the chaos following the Ides of March, the old senator had emerged as the Republic's voice, delivering a series of devastating speeches called the Philippics that eviscerated Antony's character, competence, and legitimacy. Cicero painted Antony as a drunken, dissolute barbarian unfit to lick Caesar's boots, let alone inherit his position. Antony never forgave him. More than any conspirator, more than any enemy, Cicero had to die. Octavian, who owed his early political career to Cicero's mentorship and support, agreed to the old man's execution without hesitation. It was his first great betrayal, but it wouldn't be his last. The 18-year-old who had once sat at Cicero's feet, learning the arts of oratory and statecraft, now signed his teacher's death warrant as coldly as a business transaction. The assassins found Cicero at his villa near the coast, where he was preparing to flee to Greece. His servants urged him to resist, to barricade the house and fight, but Cicero, who had spent his life wielding words rather than weapons, ordered them to stand down. He had no stomach for violence, even in self-defense. When the killers arrived, the 63-year-old orator walked out to meet them with dignity and tact. He offered his neck to their swords without protest or pleading. They struck off his head with a single blow, then, on Antony's specific orders, severed the hands that had written the speeches that so offended their master. In an act of supreme barbarity that shocked even Rome's violence-hardened population, they carried Cicero's head and hands back to the city and nailed them to the speaker's platform in the Forum, the very rostrum where he had delivered his greatest speeches, where he had defended the Republic with words when others had failed to defend it with swords. Antony's wife Fulvia, a woman whose cruelty matched her husband's, reportedly pulled out a hairpin and repeatedly stabbed Cicero's tongue, the organ that had caused her husband such embarrassment. The symbolism was complete. The voice of the Republic had been literally and figuratively silenced. With Rome purged of enemies and their treasuries filled with blood money, the triumvirs turned their attention eastward. The great reckoning was coming. Brutus and Cassius had assembled their forces in Macedonia and were preparing to march on Italy. The final confrontation that would determine whether Caesar's ghost would be avenged or his assassins would complete their revolution was at hand. The armies that gathered at Philippi in 42 BC represented the largest concentration of Roman military power in history. Over 200,000 men converged on the plains of eastern Macedonia, an entire generation of Romans prepared to slaughter each other in the name of competing visions of what Rome should be. On one side stood the forces of the triumvirate, Antony and Octavian commanding 28 battle-hardened legions, veterans of Caesar's Gallic campaigns, mixed with newer recruits, burning with desire to avenge their fallen commander. They marched under Caesar's name and fought for Caesar's memory, their standards decorated with images of the deified dictator. On the other side, Brutus and Cassius commanded 19 legions of their own, funded by the systematic looting of the eastern provinces and reinforced by local auxiliaries and allied contingents. They fought for an ideal that was already dying, the restoration of the Roman Republic, the revival of senatorial government, the dream of a Rome ruled by law rather than strongmen. The two forces faced each other across the battlefield, like armies from different ages. This wasn't just a military conflict, it was a clash between the dying Roman Republic and the emerging Roman Empire, between the old world of collective leadership and the new world of personal autocracy. The liberators' strategy was sound, dictated by Cassius's military experience and practical wisdom. Their forces were better supplied, having spent months accumulating provisions and equipment. They controlled the sea lanes, ensuring continued access to reinforcements and supplies from their eastern strongholds. Most importantly, they held the high ground and could afford to wait. Cassius understood that time was on their side. The longer the campaign dragged on, the more problems would mount for the triumvirs. Their supply lines stretched across hostile territory, their troops, far from home and fighting for the ambitions of their commanders rather than immediate survival, might begin to waver. Disease and desertion could accomplish what battle could not. But Cassius reckoned without his co-commander's psychological state. Brutus, the philosophical idealist who had justified Caesar's assassination as a moral necessity, was coming apart under the weight of command and the horror of civil war. The omens in Brutus's camp were terrible. 2 eagles that had followed the Republican legions from Asia Minor were replaced by crows and vultures the day they reached Philippi, a sign that any Roman would recognize as the favor of the gods shifting from life to death. More disturbing still were Brutus's private torments. According to multiple sources, including his closest friends, the ghost of Julius Caesar appeared to him in his command tent on the night before battle. "Who are you?" Brutus allegedly asked the apparition. "I am your evil spirit, Brutus," came the reply. "We shall meet at Philippi." Whether this was Caesar's actual ghost, the projection of Brutus's guilt, or a convenient literary invention by later historians, the effect on the Republican commander was undeniable. The man who had once stood in the Senate House and justified tyrannicide as virtue was now haunted by the consequences of his actions. Brutus's officers, sensing their commander's weakness and fearing that delay would only benefit their enemies, pressured him to abandon Cassius's cautious strategy and force a decisive battle. Against his co-commander's better judgment, against military wisdom, against every rational calculation, Brutus gave the order to attack. The First Battle of Philippi on October 3rd, 42 BC, was chaos incarnate. The engagement began at dawn with both armies stretched across the plain in traditional formation. On the Republican right, Brutus faced Octavian's forces. On the left, Cassius confronted Mark Antony's veterans. What followed was not one battle, but two simultaneous engagements with completely opposite outcomes. Brutus's attack on the right succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. His legions, fighting with the desperate fury of men who knew their cause was lost if they failed, smashed through Octavian's lines like a hammer through glass. The young Caesar's troops, many of them raw recruits seeing their first major battle, broke and ran. Their camp was overrun, their standards captured, their commander barely escaping with his life. From Brutus's perspective, it was a crushing victory. The Republic seemed to be reborn in that moment of triumph. Liberty restored by the very sword that had struck down tyranny. His men celebrated wildly as they sacked Octavian's camp, convinced that the war was won. But simultaneously, on the other flank, history was writing a very different story. Mark Antony's veteran legions, led by Caesar's most experienced general, demolished Cassius's forces with professional brutality. These were men who had conquered Gaul, who had fought in the civil wars, who knew their trade of killing as well as any soldiers who ever lived. They advanced in perfect formation, weathered Cassius's initial charge, and then rolled forward like an unstoppable machine of death. Cassius's lines bent, buckled, and shattered. His camp was taken, his men scattered, his carefully accumulated supplies captured or destroyed. The tactical genius who had masterminded Caesar's assassination found himself watching his own army disintegrate before his eyes. Two battles, two completely opposite results, and in between them, the fog of war that would decide the fate of Western civilization. Cassius had withdrawn to a hill overlooking the battlefield to better observe the fighting and coordinate his forces. From his elevated position, he could see smoke rising from what appeared to be Brutus's camp. What he couldn't see, couldn't know, was that this was actually his own men celebrating their victory and looting Octavian's abandoned position. When he spotted a column of cavalry galloping toward his position, Cassius assumed the worst. These were actually Brutus's men, riding to inform him of their triumph on the right flank. But in the dust and distance, with the sun in his eyes and his nerves stretched to the breaking point, Cassius saw only enemy horsemen approaching to capture or kill him. In that moment of profound misunderstanding, the man who had initiated the conspiracy against Caesar, who had recruited Brutus and planned the assassination, who had fought brilliantly to restore the republic he loved, made the decision that would doom everything he had fought for. "Take this," he told his freedman Pindarus, pressing his own dagger into the man's hands. "Free me from life." Pindarus, a former slave who owed everything to Cassius's kindness, begged his master to reconsider, to wait for more information, to see what the approaching cavalry actually wanted. But Cassius was beyond persuasion. He covered his face with his military cloak, unwilling to watch his own death, and guided Pindarus's hand to his throat. The blade that entered Cassius's neck was, according to legend, the same dagger he had used to stab Julius Caesar in the Senate house 2 years earlier. The irony was perfect and terrible. The practical, calculating man who had started the conspiracy was killed, not by his enemies, but by his own tragic miscalculation and the weapon of his own crime. Minutes later, Brutus's messengers arrived at the hilltop, shouting news of victory and looking for their co-commander. They found only a corpse and a weeping freedman who had just murdered the man he loved most in the world. When Brutus himself arrived and saw Cassius's body, his spirit broke entirely. Through tears, he called his dead friend and brother-in-law the last of the Romans, the final representative of the old republican virtues of duty, honor, and practical wisdom. The conspiracy's brain was dead, but its soul, the idealistic Brutus, remained alive. He still commanded a substantial army, still held the high ground, still had advantages that a competent general might have exploited. But Brutus was no general, and the death of Cassius had shattered what remained of his confidence and will. For 3 weeks the two sides maintained an uneasy standoff across the battlefield, 21 dawns and 21 sunsets, while the armies watched each other and prepared for the final confrontation that everyone knew was coming. In the Republican camp, morale collapsed entirely. Cassius's pointless death had demoralized the troops and eliminated the one leader who might have salvaged victory from the disaster. Brutus, racked by guilt and haunted by Caesar's ghost, was barely functional as a commander. His legions, many of them mercenaries fighting for pay rather than principle, began to desert in significant numbers. The officers who remained pressured Brutus constantly, urging him to attack before the army dissolved entirely. They could see their forces melting away, could sense that delay would only benefit their enemies. Time, which Cassius had counted as their ally, had become their enemy. Brutus, the philosopher general, found himself trapped by forces beyond his control. The man who had killed Caesar to preserve the Republic was watching that same Republic die in his hands. He was no longer commanding events. Events were commanding him. On October 23rd, exactly 20 days after the first battle, Brutus gave the order for the final attack. The Second Battle of Philippi lacked the chaotic uncertainty of the first engagement. It was systematic, professional, and utterly one-sided. Brutus's demoralized legions charged with desperation rather than conviction, while Antony and Octavian's veterans met them with the confidence of men who knew they were fighting for the winning side. The Republican lines, already weakened by desertions and undermined by poor leadership, bent under the initial assault, then buckled, then broke entirely. What began as an organized retreat quickly became a rout, then a massacre, as Antony's cavalry pursued the fleeing Republicans across the battlefield. The dream of the Roman Republic didn't die with speeches about liberty or noble declarations about virtue. It died with the sound of thousands of men screaming in terror as they ran for their lives, abandoning their weapons and their cause in their desperation to survive. Brutus managed to escape the slaughter with a small group of his most loyal officers and friends. They took refuge in the hills near the battlefield, listening to the victory celebrations of their enemies echoing across the night. The man who had briefly held power in Rome, who had been hailed as a new founder of republican virtue, was now a hunted fugitive hiding in a Greek forest. There, in the cold darkness, with nowhere to run and no hope of rescue, Marcus Junius Brutus finally understood the full magnitude of what he had done. He looked at his remaining friends and spoke words that revealed his soul's complete fracture. "Virtue, I have followed you as a reality, but you were only a word." The idealist had crashed against reality's wall. He had killed his mentor for an abstract principle, and that principle had died before his eyes. Brutus refused to be captured. The humiliation of being paraded through Rome's streets in chains was worse than death. He asked his officer Clytus to kill him. Clytus wept and refused. He asked Dardanus, the same answer. Finally, his friend Strato agreed to hold a sword while Brutus ran upon it. The conspiracy's soul died instantly on that blade. When Antony found the body, he covered it with his own purple cloak, calling Brutus the noblest Roman of them all. But Octavian ordered the head severed and sent to Rome to be thrown at Caesar's statue. The hunt for the remaining 58 conspirators lasted over a decade. One by one, they fell. Gaius Trebonius, tortured and beheaded in Asia, his head used as a ball by soldiers. Decimus Brutus, betrayed by a Gallic chief for gold. Cassius Pomensis, the last to die, executed in Athens, 14 years after the assassination. Not one of Caesar's assassins died of old age. All met violent ends in battle, by assassination, by their own hands, or betrayed by former friends. The blood debt was paid in full. But while Octavian hunted Caesar's killers, something else was happening. With each Republican senator who died, his power grew absolute. The conspirators had stabbed Caesar to prevent monarchy. In the vacuum they created, they had birthed something far worse, an emperor. When the last assassin was dead, Octavian stood alone atop the Roman world. In 27 BC, he brilliantly restored the Republic, while keeping all real power. The Senate, grateful for peace, named him Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. He ruled for 44 years and died peacefully in his bed, worshipped as a god. The liberators had killed Caesar to stop a king. Instead, they created an emperor and destroyed the Republic forever. Their 23 dagger wounds didn't prevent tyranny. They merely chose the tyrant. The blood pooling on the Senate floor that March Day had sealed Rome's fate. The conspirators thought they were heroes saving freedom. They were gravediggers burying the last remnants of Republican government beneath the marble stones of their own making.